Welcome and thanks for joining me. So tonight we're going to drill down on some of the key topics that I think will best help you prepare for the CISM exam. Certainly several topics that make this exam very unique relative to any you've taken before. So just to keep our session orderly, keep everything friendly in the chat, no selling anything, and I'll have a recording out within a few hours of the time we wrap up the session. So we never have any problems. You all are great. So just know that if you need to drop off at any point, I'll have a follow-up email out with all the resources I mentioned, as well as a recording of this session. But everything that I share tonight is effective for the latest release of the CISM. So we'll talk through some frequently asked questions. I do want to touch on, before we get into the 10, I want to touch on some exam prep materials to make sure you have effective materials that are affordable for you. But then we're going to dive in to 10 key topics. Now we'll wrap up this session with coverage of a strategy for answering difficult questions. It works for multiple exams. It's been very effective for many of my students, and we will walk through some questions together. But again, links to all the resources after the session. Throw questions in the chat as we go. I'm happy to keep an eye on the chat and answer those questions as we go along, so you get the questions when we're still on the topic. Now, if you don't know who I am, certainly I deliver a lot of cybersecurity training material on YouTube and in these live sessions, but in my day job, I'm a VCSO for a regional bank. I'm a cyber strategist in regulated industries, so I spend a lot of time exercising the types of skills that you'll find on the CISM exam. And in the past few years, I've helped probably hundreds of thousands or maybe a million exam candidates at this point study for certifications from Microsoft, the CISSP, CCSP, Security Plus, and now the CISM, where I have a full training series that's free on YouTube. So here are the 10 topics we're going to dive into. Let's start with just a quick look at the exam. So the series I put together follows the exam syllabus. There are 4 domains in the exam, and ISACA divides each of those domains into a Part A and a Part B. So I've got a series and a consolidated full course video that covers that. Now, the exam itself from ISACA is a bit different than some of the other exams as well, because number one, it's not an adaptive exam. You get 150 multiple choice questions, 4 hours long. So you've got 240 minutes to complete. It's computer-based, and you can take it at the testing center or remotely via online proctoring. But that's a minute and a half per question, so time management is going to be very important for you in preparing for the exam, and we'll touch on that tonight. The scoring for this exam, it ranges from 2 to 800. Minimum passing is 450. Perfect score, of course, is 800. There's no mention of needing to pass individual domains, but one can imagine it's fairly difficult to fail one of these domains and still pass the exam, so you really want to go into this exam prepared to pass all the domains. You get a preliminary pass or fail right there. When you take the exam, you get the official score mailed to you a few days later. And you've got testing centers all over the place. Many choose that online option. The cost is a bit less for ISACA members, though you do have to pay for an ISACA membership, so that eats into any money you're going to save there. But 4 domains. Now, if we look at the previous edition of the exam, you'll notice that in domains 3 and 4, we see increased focus, especially in incident management, which covers a fair bit of the operational aspects of what you're expected to know in terms of incident management process. So I want to walk through the flow of the domains here. I find that the syllabus here flows in a very logical order relative to how your information security program would play out in the real world. So it begins with governance, which you can really think of as your oversight, and then the information security strategy. So once we have the governance, our guardrails, our oversight in place, we develop our strategy. This is going to include the roadmap, a document I want to make sure you understand. But there's heavy focus in the CISM on aligning with business needs. It's all about the business. This is really pervasive throughout the exam. You want to remember that when you're answering questions on the exam. Because as you're probably aware at this point, your role is one of a security leader. Think of yourself as the information security manager when you're sitting in the chair. So domain 2 is all about risk. It's part A, focusing on risk assessment, and part B, focusing on risk response. So again, a very logical flow. The quantitative risk analysis formulas that you may be familiar with if you've taken the CISSP or the Security Plus do come up in the official study materials. I will say there's a fair bit less focus there, and the focus that I see on those formulas really drills down on bottom line answers with the formula results of single loss expectancy, annualized loss expectancy. So bottom line end results. The risk formulas are covered, just not with quite the level of detail and focus I've seen elsewhere. And in domain 3, the information security program, we have program development and then program management. So again, a very logical flow here where we're developing the program according to our strategy and roadmap, and then the implementation of that program. But do bear in mind that while you're not going to be tested on technology directly on this exam, the exam does expect familiarity with security technologies. It does really focus more on how to choose and apply those technologies, though. Don't expect hands-on technical questions. This exam is really a management exam focusing on the process. And when I say it covers technologies, you could see reference to a range of technologies from cryptography and PKI to network security, cloud, code security. But just remember, this is definitely a management exam. The tech would be referenced indirectly. They assume you understand how to choose and apply security controls rather than delving into their detailed design or operation. So understanding, where a firewall fits or when a firewall fits, where technical controls fit for data security, for example, would be more important than understanding anything about how they're configured. This is a vendor agnostic exam, so you're really expected to know high-level use cases and functionality for a range of technologies that include everything I mentioned there, and then tech like CISM, IDS, DLP. So I'm using acronyms here intentionally. These are all acronyms that you should know. They're actually, for the most part, in the list of official acronyms from ISACA that they say you should be familiar with. But focus on thinking like a manager. I know that phrase is something you're familiar with from other exams, but you really need to understand the strategic why and how, not deep technical specifics. And then domain 4 is all about incident management. So part A is readiness, and there's pretty heavy focus there on the business impact analysis, which feeds into the business continuity and disaster recovery plan. So we'll dig into BIA as one of our key 10 topics tonight. And then it wraps up with incident management response. So you're dealing with the implementation of your plan. So I do want to talk about just day 1 strategy here. How do you get started? Well, as with any journey, it really begins with having a plan. So you want to make sure that you have a strategy for how you're going to study, how you will assess your weaknesses. You want to chart the course before you take off. Remember, you have 150 questions in 240 minutes, so that's in the ballpark of a minute and a half per question. It's a little more than that, but pretty close. And there are some foundational topics you need to be familiar with that assume some foundational technical knowledge. And remember, the advanced questions you get assume that you have that foundational knowledge. Now, many topics you're only going to see once or twice. You're studying hundreds of concepts for an exam that's 150 questions. So don't be surprised when you don't see a question on a particular topic. And relative to the CISM, I will talk to you specifically about the mindset you need for this exam, what your focus really needs to be, because you are, in this exam, a security leader, very strategy focused. But you want to build your plan, work that plan, know your readiness before you schedule the exam. And I do recommend to most folks not to schedule your exam until you're pretty close to ready. You certainly don't want to just if deadlines bother you, scheduling that exam before you get started can create an artificial hurdle, a barrier that you focus on and worry about. On the other hand, if you just study and when you're 75 or 80% to ready, then schedule your exam, it's a less stressful experience. But I know there are many people out there that will schedule the exam because it eliminates their procrastination. And if you're good with that, you do what works for you. I just wanted to throw that out there so you give it some thought before you make that scheduling decision. So let's talk about the resources you have available to you. So certainly ISACA has some official resources. They have the review manual and the questions, answers, and explanations. Now, what I will say about that review manual, there's no coverage of the technology that I mentioned that you're expected to more or less walk in knowing based on your experience. It's not a standalone guide, and the book states you will need more than just this book to pass the exam. And that book is $150, give or take. You might pay a little more or a little less if you get a used copy. It does list the technologies you should know for the exam. It just doesn't cover them. The questions, answers, and explanations, 1,000+ questions, sorted by domain and also in a quiz format. Now you can buy the book, which is another one that's about $150, or you can get the online database version, which is available to everyone, but it is somewhat expensive. If I just pop over and look at the questions, answers, and explanations, it's basically $3.99 for non-members, $2.99 for members. I do hear exam candidates say that they felt that it helped them to understand ISACA wording on the exam. Personally, I don't think it's strictly necessary, but it's out there, just so you're aware. Now, there are 3 good manuals that you're probably aware of if you've gone out and shopped for a book. You've got the all-in-one guide, you've got the study guide from Cybex, and then you have the CISM exam prep guide from Packet. So varying lengths. The length in large part I think comes down to how many questions they include in writing in the exam guide. But you'll notice that each of these has 300 online questions, so you've got some material to work with there. I will say that the all-in-one guide follows a sequential path through the domains in order, more or less, as does the Packet guide. It follows the chapters, the domains sequentially as well. The Cybex guide jumps around. That author is prone to doing that because he likes to lay out the topics in what he sees as a logical order. So if I were to pick one here, and I'm not married to any one, I would say probably the all-in-one is a good middle ground, but I think you do just fine with any of these. And there's one other book that I hope you'll consider, and that's mine, the CISM The Last Mile. It's available on LeanPub. I cover 350+ pages of clear explanations. I really try to distill the information on every exam topic. I have dozens of full color diagrams and reference tables, and my visuals are intended to be useful. I don't put pictures in there for no reason. They tend to be useful, and that's what I think a diagram or an image should be for on an exam prep guide. But I'm trying to distill the what, when, and why of the key topics. You can find this book for $10 on LeanPub. I have intentionally made it very inexpensive so you can afford to buy one of these, add The Last Mile, and I think you're in good shape, even if you don't have the funds to go buy the more expensive ISACA manuals. And then in terms of additional questions, if you wanted a budget option, I think Pocket Prep is quite good for testing your knowledge and helping you to ready yourself for the exam. There are some exam flashcards from yours truly. My team and I have curated a set of about 1,150 flashcards you can use on any device, basically laid out with categories, with domains and topics pre-selected for you. So I've done some of the chunking when we think of an exam prep strategy. I've broken it down into parts for you based on those domains, and you get additional references like the pages in The Last Mile that you can go read, links to my video series, and some additional reading. But I'll put links to all those resources in the meeting chat and in the follow-up. But hearing good things based on what I've put together at this point. All right, enough of that. Let's dig in to the 10 key topics. All right, in we go. So in terms of study time, there's no prize for studying the longest. I really want to help you to be effective in the time you have to study and prepare for this exam more quickly. It should be an affair that you measure in weeks, generally speaking. So I would think certainly less than 90 days for almost all candidates. So spaced repetition is a good place, a good technique to incorporate into your process. There's a lot of power in repetition when we look at the science. So spaced repetition is where we study a topic and we revisit that topic on a periodic basis, coming back hours, days, and even weeks later. And what you'll find when you touch on a topic multiple times is each time you come back, you're going to remember a bit more, and you're going to remember it for a bit longer. So you forget a little less each time. What we say is that the forgetting curve, as it's called, gets longer and shallower with each repetition. So a lot of power in that. Now, how long does it take to memorize anything is another good question. The science gives us answers there. So to memorize quickly, we can repeat in rapid succession within a few minutes, a few hours, a couple of days. And to memorize for a long period of time, to put information into your long-term memory banks, you would add some repetitions days, weeks, or even months out, potentially. But when you look at those repetitions there in rapid succession, that's why boot camps are so successful, because they give you a lot of information in the short term, which can help you pass the exam. The long term means information is going to stick with you for use in your career. Which path you take, entirely up to you. Here to advise, not to judge. You do what works for you. It also helps to use multiple sources. So that idea they gave us when we were kids that everybody is a visual learner, an auditory learner, a tactile learner, it's not exactly true. Everyone benefits from multiple resources. And what I suggest to candidates is use the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, when preparing for this exam. So what do I mean by that? Well, consider all exam content and study materials, and your exam prep is a funnel that takes you from all study materials down to what you need to focus on. So you want to filter down to your weak areas with practice exams, targeted reading, PDF and flashcard review. The practice exams in particular, I think, are a good checkpoint to identify where your weak areas are, and that's what you want to focus on, is what you don't know. You don't want to spend a bunch of time reviewing content, and concepts that are very familiar to you. Not the best use of your time. So again, take everything, filter it down to what you need, using the combination of materials that make sense to you. And the materials that I would suggest, so you can begin with video. That's my favorite, but and then move into reviewing and quizzes, but mix, match, and repeat based on your preferences. So I can give you my preferred order here. I like to start with video so I can quickly assess where I need to spend some focus time, and then I'll move into reviewing, say, a PDF or some live quiz. So flashcards are great if you have a partner to do some live quiz with you, though. Using my PDFs that come along with the video, it's a great exercise to checkpoint your knowledge. And using practice exams to identify how close to ready you are is a great idea. So if you're getting 50% on an exam for Domain 1, that's a good indication that you need to do some more preparation on Domain 1. If I were using practice quizzes from any of the official study guides, I call them official because those are well-proven authors at this point, in my opinion. If you're using any of those questions, if you're using anything from Pocket Prep or even ISACA, I would say aim for 80% as an indication of readiness. But also practice time management in these scenarios. So make sure that you are able to answer questions in about a minute and a half each. And you don't have to do that from day one, but over time, incorporate that in there. Now, most of those practice question engines will have some exam mode that gives you time limitations. But even when you're in study mode, when there's no time limit, use the stopwatch on your phone and just watch your time and just try to get yourself into that rhythm where you have that minute and a half down before you walk into the testing center on exam day or log in to take that test online. If you don't practice time management before exam day, it's going to be a rough exam. And when it comes to reading the guides, I would say use the guides for closing knowledge gaps, not cover-to-cover reading. Even the best written exam prep guide is not a fun read. So use it to close your knowledge gaps because it's not going to be the most effective way to secure this material in your brain. But multiple resources of each type are a great idea. You mix and match in a way that feels right to you, that you feel is effective. And when it comes to the practice quizzes in assessing your exam readiness, I would say use these quizzes as checkpoints. Again, you can take a quiz on a specific domain. So most of your resources are going to give you the option to take a quiz on just domain 1 or just domain 2, for example. And when you take that individual domain, use your scoring. Even if it's only a 20 or 30 question quiz, you should be scoring 80% reliably if you are in fact ready for this exam. If you're only scoring 50, 60%, yes, I would be concerned that maybe you don't have the concepts down that you need to call yourself ready for this exam. Okay, I see a question here. So about the wording of these questions versus the CISSP exam. Well, I think the short answer is the CISSP tends to be a bit more technical. If you just hold tight, I'm actually going to speak to that here in just a moment. So we'll dig into that. Good question. So let's talk about the exam mindset. Now, I mentioned this is a leadership exam. You need to be thinking like a security leader. Let me explain a bit more about what that means. So in terms of mindset, the CISM exam really trends toward the tactical and strategic in terms of your leadership focus, where if we were to compare that to the CISSP exam, it's a bit more tactical and operational. It is a security leader exam, but the CISSP leans more technical than CISM, and it tests technical knowledge more directly than is true of the CISM. So what I will say, a bit of good news, if you pass the CISSP, if you pass the Security Plus, your technical knowledge of security should be adequate for the CISM exam. Again, technology is unlikely to be directly tested, but there is that assumption that you're walking in to the exam with that experience, so you understand that technical knowledge, that technical content from your experience in the real world. All right, so let's talk about the process or technology focus of this exam. So there are, as I mentioned, some foundational technologies you're expected to be familiar with. And again, that's assuming prior technical experience. If I were to look at Domain 3, there's an expectation around asset identification and classification, and there's a heavy focus there on information assets. So you should be familiar with the core functionality, the purpose of technologies like digital rights management, data loss prevention, cloud access security broker. You should understand your considerations and techniques around data minimization and data collection, use, and data security. So securing data at rest, in transit, and in use. If we look at 3B, which has a fair bit of focus on controlled design and selection, topics like digital certificates would be relevant. Understanding the basics, the fundamentals of encryption, symmetric encryption, asymmetric encryption, also known as public key encryption. You should know the difference between hashing and encryption. And you should know the function of digital certificates. And moving on there, looking in 3B, we can also see cloud having some focus there, understanding the shared responsibility model, cloud service models, cloud deployment models. We'll actually talk about these tonight. I think they are highly relevant. You should understand the basics of virtualization and network security. And by the by, I cover all of these in line in the right places within the CISM exam prep video series on YouTube. I also cover them in the Last Mile guide as a supplement to your other study materials. to make sure you have all the technology in your head you need. When we look at Domain 4 at incident response, there's an area of incident response tools and techniques, so you should be familiar with concepts like access control, authentication, availability, confidentiality, integrity. So the 3 legs of the CIA triad we see there. You should understand non-repudiation, the role of digital certificates, or digital signatures rather, in non-repudiation. So, again, not tested directly, but you get my point here. It's indirectly tested. But if you've consumed my content for CISSP or Security Plus, don't worry too much about the underlying tech. I think you're in good shape there. It's really more about when to apply controls to address risk on this exam. So let's dive into number 4 on the list, which is key terminology. So there are some terms that come up on the CISM exam that I haven't seen anywhere else, and I want to cover those with you tonight. I think if you understand these terms and know them well, studying for the exam is going to be significantly easier because these terms come up quite a lot. So let's start with governance. So governance ensures the needs of various stakeholders are evaluated to determine that we have balanced, agreed upon enterprise objectives. The objectives are then used to set our direction through prioritization and decision making, and to monitor our performance and compliance with those objectives along the way. So think of governance as direction and oversight from the right people in the organization. Governance is going to typically come top down from the organization's leaders. And that's going to feed strategy, the next term on the list. So strategy defines the desired state of security for an organization, aligning with its business objectives. Again, you're seeing that mention of business objectives. But strategy outlines a roadmap for achieving this desired state by addressing identified risks and vulnerabilities. So that strategy will include checkpoints. It's going to include near-term and mid-term goals as well as your long-term objectives. But there are checkpoints along the way which allow us to course correct should conditions change along our journey. Another good question here, is the roadmap like a project plan? Well, think of that roadmap as multiple smaller projects. So the roadmap would be multiple projects that roll up into the information security program roadmap. So yes, projects, but really multiple projects. So the roadmap is not a project plan, it's multiple project plans. With checkpoints, again, so we can course correct should conditions change. For example, maybe we have a new service added for the business. Maybe the business strategy evolves, at which point we're going to adjust our roadmap so we're still charting the course to that desired destination. So the next term on the list is management. So management implements the direction set by governance, following the roadmap set by strategy. It includes planning, building, operation, and monitoring, and managing operational risk tolerance. So stated very simply, it's following that roadmap, implementing that strategy under the direction and oversight of our governance. So you see a logical progression here. Okay, the next term is compliance. So an organization's adherence to laws, regulations, standards, and contractual obligations are what speak to compliance. Basically, the obligations that govern its operations. So this involves implementing policies, procedures, and controls to ensure all activities meet these established requirements, whether they are legal, regulatory, or contractual, and they uphold the organization's ethical and legal standards. But there are 3 types of compliance: legal, regulatory, or contractual. In some discussions, you will hear organizational compliance, so basically adherence to the organization's policies, procedures, etc. But the 3 that are front and center and the most critical are legal, regulatory, or contractual. And then we have due diligence. So unlike the CISSP exam where we see due diligence and due care, you really only see mention of due diligence in the ISACA focus on the materials, but due diligence are the reasonable steps an organization, tongue-tied there. So due diligence are the reasonable steps that an organization takes to identify, assess, and address cybersecurity risks. That would include proactively evaluating an organization's networks, their systems, their sensitive data, to uncover vulnerabilities, and implement controls that protect against threats. So for example, auditing IT infrastructure, testing incident response plans, planning out our awareness training. These are all due diligence to make sure that our organization has security controls in place that are operating effectively, that the team is educated and adhering to our compliance requirements and prepared to respond under incident circumstances. Okay, I want to talk about accountability versus responsibility. So accountability is the obligation to answer for one's actions, decisions, or results. Accountability cannot be delegated. Remember that. It rests with the person who originally assigned the task. And the entity accountable will be a single person or team. But responsibility, on the other hand, is the duty or obligation to complete a task or to achieve a specific goal. So the person accountable for a result can delegate responsibility to others. But the delegator, the person who is assigning those responsibilities for implementation, still remains accountable for the overall outcome. That's the key difference. Responsible can include many people. In a global organization, for example, I might delegate responsibility of data security to a different person or team on every continent because the compliance requirements will differ in the various countries. But as that C-level leader in the organization, I'm still going to be accountable for the end result. So for the exam, remember that responsibility can be delegated, but accountability cannot. There may be multiple parties responsible, but in the end, only one party will be accountable. Another phrase that I think is very unique to the CISM exam is assurance processes. So assurance processes are the systematic methods and activities that confirm to the organization's stakeholders that security policies and controls are effectively implemented, operating as intended, aligned with the organization's overall risk management and compliance goals. For example, risk assessments, security audits, vulnerability scans, penetration testing, compliance reviews, all examples of assurance processes. So I don't think I've seen this phrase on any other security exam I've encountered. All right, two more, also unique to CISM. The Charter, which is a document that specifies who has the power to act, what they are responsible for, and why the information security program exists. And hand in hand with the Charter is the scope. The scope defines where, to whom, and to what extent the information security program applies. So a typical approach for the scope and the Charter and scope will be a single security charter that includes governance and operational aspects along with a clearly defined scope. So the two together will typically be included in one document because of their close relationship. To bottom line it for you, the charter is really about authority and objectives. Who's in charge, who's accountable, and what are the objectives? And the scope is coverage and boundary. So what is our program focused on? But a comprehensive security strategy is built on a clear roadmap, an understanding of the resources required to achieve those objectives, and awareness of constraints. So let's talk about that roadmap a bit further. So this is, again, the path to the desired state. So the roadmap provides a guide to achieve desired state, including the people, processes, and resources, like the tools and technologies required to meet those targets. It outlines the short and long-term projects and everything in between, and the resources, the people, processes, and tech needed to transition from the current state to the desired state. It breaks down the overall goal into achievable checkpoint-driven initiatives that allow for adjustments as conditions change. So if we have a change in the security landscape or the business landscape, or both, we can adjust our roadmap to remain on course. And by maximizing the use of our existing assets and recognizing potential limitations, the strategy can remain effective and realistic in the face of changing conditions. But just remember, the path to desired state as laid out in the roadmap is comprised of multiple projects and milestones. Bottom line, for this exam, it's all about the business. You've got to always bear in mind the security business alignment. The security program is there to serve the business and to deliver value. So the security program has to understand and support the business objectives, and this ensures that security measures enhance rather than hinder the organization's operations and growth. If we find that security is hindering or preventing conduction of normal business, that it's not doing its job. Security alignment with business objectives is a common theme throughout the CISM exam, and you should always bear that very carefully in mind. Another good question here, are there any frameworks that we should memorize for the exam? Well, so much like technology, you're expected to be familiar with the core purpose of several frameworks. You're not going to be tested, though, on the steps within those frameworks. I'm going to make a note here, and I will talk about that a bit further when we get to the discussion on guidelines, standards, and policies just a bit later in this session. It's on our top 10 list. Okay, that brings us to number 5, which is incident management. So incident management is unique on most exams. I feel like the approach on the CISM is a very practical approach. You're not memorizing any framework here, but there are definitely a sequence of events and some key terms you need to be very familiar with. So let's start at the beginning. So an event versus an incident, you should know the difference. So an event is any occurrence of an activity like a login, access to a file, or a process endpoint. Most events are normal, essentially. An incident, on the other hand, is an event with potential or actual negative impact on the business or security posture. So an incident requires investigation and response. But context is everything when it comes to whether an event is also an incident. For example, a login at 3 a.m. might be an incident, but it's perfectly normal if the user is traveling, and we do this by evaluating events against baselines of normal activities. I do remember one time I was actually at a table in a discussion with security leadership and a couple of the architects, and somebody logged in from the Bahamas while we were talking, another one of the managers who was not in the room. And somebody said, "Hey, speak of what we're talking about here, so-and-so just logged in from the Bahamas." And so the CIO was in the room, and he said, "Hey, why don't you call him and check?" They called and asked the guy, "John, what are you doing?" He said, "I'm laying on the beach in the Bahamas. What are you doing?" So again, it's all about context. John happened to be on vacation in the Bahamas, so even though the time was unusual he was logging in, it was not an incident because there was a clear explanation. But the decision point of classifying an event as an incident is based on the potential impact after gathering relevant information, such as making that phone call to see where the heck John was. So let's talk about the exam focus on incident management versus incident response, so how ISACA sees it. And I always try to cover these topics in the ISACA perspective so you're well aligned for the exam. So incident management is the strategic program and overarching framework for how we address incidents. Incident response is triggered when an incident is declared. So think of incident management as the high-level planning, policies, resource allocation, governance, recovery, and continuous improvement plans. Incident response focuses on immediate actions, identifying an incident, containing it, eradicating the source, and recovering the business. Incident management ensures the organization is prepared and aligned with business goals, so when there is an incident, they can respond quickly and effectively. The goal of incident response is to minimize immediate impact, to contain an incident, and then to restore operations quickly. Think of incident management as the big picture governance in how the organization will address incidents. Think of incident response as the boots on the ground action in responding to an incident. So the relationship here is that incident response executes parts of the overall incident management strategy, and together they build resilience in service operation. They ensure the organization is prepared to respond effectively under stressful circumstances when there is an incident. It is key that senior management support is in place for both of these. If we don't have support from the top for implementing and improving these processes, it will fail. So let's talk about incident categorization versus incident classification. These come up in the ISACA material as well. So categorization really tells us what kind of incident it is. The purpose here is to group incidents by their nature. Malware infections, network outage, hardware failure. This helps us route potential incidents to the right team. It also enables reporting and trend analysis, so we can see if we have a large number of incidents happening in one given area, which would indicate we need to make some improvements there. But the outcome here is that we have a standard way to understand the types of incidents that are happening in our environment. And I've seen that surface in real life. I do remember on one occasion I had a CIO that said the mainframe is the most secure and stable system in the entire organization. Well, when I looked at the trends of the incidents, of the outages we had in our environment, the number one source of outage was actually the mainframe. So it was actually statistically the least reliable system of all. It turned out the problem was a people problem, people doing things they shouldn't have been doing during business hours. So it wasn't so much the mainframe itself, it was the use of the mainframe. But point being, we had reporting in place, trend analysis, where we could identify the answer to that question. Where are our problems happening? And it was because of categorization of our incidents. So then we have classification. A classification tells us how bad or severe the incident is. The purpose of classification is to assess severity, business impact, urgency, and to determine the priority level. Is it critical, high, medium, low? How quickly do we need to respond, and what resources do we need to put on this? What are our escalation triggers? Because certainly when we go to address the incident, there are going to be checkpoints where we need leadership input. But the outcome is clear priority in ensuring the focus on the most significant business impacts first. So again, categorization is the type or what kind of incident. Classification is the priority and the impact. Now, you will see mention of a couple of incident management or response frameworks. So what I'm looking at here, preparation, detection and analysis, containment, eradication, and recovery, and then post-incident activity. This is all NIST right here. This comes from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. But you see some terms in here that you're going to need to be familiar with. In particular, I see containment, eradication, and recovery. You're going to need to know these terms well. We're going to cover them right here. Don't worry. And then post-incident activity, where we examine the lessons we can learn from this incident. But this is a popular incident management methodology. But you want to focus on the common elements of the processes that I show you here, and you want to know containment, eradication, and recovery well. As with many other aspects of the CISM exam, you're not going to be tested on rote memorization of a popular incident management methodology or framework. I could also look at the SANS incident response framework, which includes preparation, the planning, policies, and tools. That's what we called incident management in the ISACA context. Identification of an incident, so detecting and verifying that incident. Containment, eradication, and recovery. 3 steps, 3 terms you need to know well. And we'll dig into these in a moment. And then it ends with lessons learned, that post-incident analysis where we identify improvements and update our plans, procedures, and potentially our controls to ensure that an incident of the same type and severity doesn't happen again. So if I were to lay it out from a general process perspective, the planning and preparation, we create our policies, we get support from leadership, we build awareness, we acquire tools. Then we have detection, triage, investigation, basically defining event versus incident, detect, validate, prioritize. Then we contain, analyze, track, recover. And then post-incident, we conduct a post-mortem examination. We identify any corrective actions, evaluate how we responded, what we did right, what we could do better next time. And then in closing the incident, we have final analysis. We submit our reports. We incorporate the lessons we learned from this incident into our processes, into our plan for how we react next time. So let's dig into those terms I said you should be familiar with. We'll start with containment. So containment is immediate action to limit or reduce the security incident impact. It's short-term and tactical. It does not fix the root cause. So think of containment like applying a tourniquet to a wound. It stops the bleeding, but it does nothing to heal the wound. It stops the bleeding so we can get the person to a medical professional. So key considerations before acting, before initiating that containment action. So number one, we need to tailor our containment strategy to the specific incident, to the circumstances, based on the type of incident, based on its severity, so its classification and categorization. We weigh the benefits of stopping the damage right now versus the risk of alerting the attacker, potential escalation from our adversary, or the potential that a specific containment action is going to interrupt conduction of business, because there may be multiple containment options, so we want to pick the one that is the most effective, because if I can contain an incident without alerting the attacker, without interrupting business, that's the option I'm going to take. And that's why it's critical that we obtain senior management approval for when and how to contain. So we're going to triage and identify how we think we should do it, and we need to make sure that we're aligned with the business. They need to understand the risks of what we're about to do. And from an incident management perspective, we need to have the plan in place so that quick briefing and approval can happen quickly when we need it to happen quickly. So an example, system compromise containment. So if we have a compromised system, containment might mean disconnecting that infected system from the network or isolating it. May mean updating firewalls to block attacker IPs or domains. We might want to scan other systems for indicators of compromise to see if lateral movement has already happened in the environment. So remember, the goal of containment is to remove attacker access everywhere. We want to prevent further spread. So when we look at just those three potential responses, disconnecting an infected system from the network, if it's one of the systems in a business service and a customer-facing service, disconnecting that infected system is immediately going to interrupt service, where some of these others may not. So the decision to contain, the focus is really about the balance here. So stopping damage now versus risk of attacker reaction. So who decides? Well, senior management makes the ultimate decision, but with input from other business and technical folks. So legal might be involved if compliance or regulatory or customer data breach is involved. The information security manager is going to be there, and potentially the incident management team who's down there doing the investigation. But you see information security manager in the middle here. And you'll see reference in ISACA to the information security manager being a role that wears multiple hats. They are a bridge between the technical teams within the organization, the IT and information security functions, and business and leadership. So you'll see that they say many of your study materials will say the information security manager wears two hats, the technical hat and the business hat. So let's talk eradication versus containment, that next term. So containment, I said, is stop the immediate spread, put out the fire. Eradication, on the other hand, is about removing the cause and the artifacts that caused the fire in the first place, fixing the faulty wiring, removing the malware or rootkit that is the source of our pain here. The goal is to prevent recurrence, So in CISM incident management terms, you should know these terms and where they occur in the incident management process. So triage would be initial assessment and prioritization, classification and categorization, for example. Containment is about limiting the spread. Mitigation, if that comes up, that's about reducing severity and starting your repair actions. Eradication, which comes up more frequently in the ISACA and the CISM context, is removing the artifacts that caused the incident in the first place. Remediation is something that might come up. That's fixing the underlying cause. But from my perspective, triage and mitigation and remediation are less likely to come up than containment, eradication, and recovery, which are the core three. So containment, limiting the spread; eradication, removing the artifacts that caused the incident; and recovery is about restoring systems to normal, securing operations back to the point they existed before the incident occurred. So going back to business as usual. And that's where we'll see another discussion about recovery and that recovery phase, which we perform after successful containment and eradication. So the goal here is to restore operations without reintroducing vulnerabilities, which means we need to have successfully eradicated first. And the ISACA material will point out that it's important not to rush to return to business as usual, because hidden threats like backdoors and rootkits may persist if recovery is hurried. We want to properly address and remediate the root cause for better long-term risk management. And the exam may actually test your ability to recognize the danger of returning to business as usual too quickly. So returning to business as usual without fixing the root cause invites repeated incidents. That's the problem. We'll get a repeat of the same thing that just happened, which is why root cause analysis is essential for both thorough eradication, so finding all attack vectors, artifacts, and removing them, and root cause analysis is also essential for secure recovery, avoiding rebuilding vulnerable systems. So we can see here that root cause analysis, identifying the causal factor, needs to happen in order to eradicate, so you can tell where it falls in the order of operations. So tell me where root cause analysis happens in this context. Is it before or after eradication? Drop it in the comments. Yeah, before. Very good. Very good. All right, key takeaways here. Eradication removes the threat and its cause. Recovery restores operations securely, brings us back to business as usual, but both require on thoroughness, root cause analysis, and careful validation before returning systems to production. And in the full course, I talk about media sanitization techniques. You should know those. We also cover digital forensics extensively in the context of the exam, that is to say. So you want to make sure you're familiar with the forensic concepts that we cover as well. All right, so that brings us to the back half of our top 10 list here. So business impact analysis. I'm going to pause here and give everyone a 5-minute break. So it's 59 after the hour. So I'll see you back here at 4 minutes after the hour. And we're back. So let's dive into number 6, business impact analysis. So we'll see this in Domain 4, Part A, where we see business impact analysis, which is an important input to our business continuity and disaster recovery plan. So you should be familiar with the primary goals of a business impact analysis, the elements, the information we will collect, as well as the benefits of a business impact analysis. So really distilling the key aspects of the business impact analysis that you need to know for the exam is my goal here. So let's start with what exactly is that business impact analysis. Well, its purpose is to determine the impact on the business if critical processes or resources fail. And the BIA is going to be the foundation for our risk management, for our business continuity and disaster recovery planning. The BIA helps the business to know where to focus in planning their business continuity and disaster recovery. So it's going to give us some key answers. How fast does a disruption hurt us in a given system or service? What do we need to recover? And what's the overall operational hit. But the BIA has to assess impacts across the three dimensions of security: confidentiality, so unauthorized data disclosure, which could mean disclosure of our sensitive customer data, which can lead to reputation damage, fines, and legal issues. And reputation damage is one of those things that's very squishy. It's very intangible because it's something that's difficult to recover. There is, for example, a certain fast food restaurant that I remember back in the late 80s or early 90s, if memory serves, had a certain food handling problem that led to many customers across the country getting sick. I don't remember exactly what it was, but all I remember when I see that restaurant is they had a food handling problem. They had a cleanliness problem. And so I don't trust that restaurant many years later. We're in 2025, and I remember that from when I was a kid. And so their reputation has never been recovered in my eyes. So that's just to say we don't want to underestimate the potential loss of the intangibles like our reputation, which can be financially much more significant than some of the tangible assets. There's loss of integrity. So unauthorized data or system changes, which can lead to bad data, to fraud, to system compromise. And then there's availability loss, where critical systems or processes are down. This is going to lead to lost productivity, lost revenue, and probably some unhappy customers. So the BIA is going to help us to identify where we need to put our focus in business continuity and disaster recovery. But the BIA needs to consider how disruptions can affect each dimension of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, each dimension of the CIA triad. So it's going to focus on criticality, prioritization, so identifying and ranking business functions by potential disruption impact. So it focuses on recovery of what matters most first. And then downtime estimation, so determining the organization's maximum tolerable downtime for processes. This is going to define the acceptable interruption window. These are acronyms that you're going to need to know for the exam. I'll put these in one place here in just a moment. They are certainly covered in the full course. And then resource requirements. So when we've identified what's critical and how quickly we need to recover, we can then identify the essential people, technologies, and facilities needed to recover within the parameters we have defined. So the resource requirements clarifies what is needed to get back online. The essential people, technology, and facilities we need to recover. And an effective approach is to analyze a manageable set of realistic scenarios. I want you to remember that. The key approach here in our analysis is to identify a manageable set of realistic scenarios with a broader group of key stakeholders. And the ISACA material points out that you don't want to only plan for the absolute worst case. You want to consider likely disruptions, which may be smaller disruptions, less impactful, easier to recover from, because we need to be prepared for all likely conditions, not just the worst case scenarios. And if we only focus on worst case, it's going to inflate our risk perception. It might skew our spending. We might spend too much money focusing on an unlikely scenario and not give due time and attention to the more likely disruptions. We need to understand loss escalations, how to impacts worsen over time. This is going to help us set realistic recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives. Two more acronyms you should be very familiar with, which we will cover. We need to assess tangible and intangible impacts. Again, measuring tangible like financial loss. So when availability is impacted, do we know there's going to be financial loss? But if we have reputation damage, such as through a data leak, that's intangible. It's more difficult to quantify, but equally important, maybe even more important. And then aligning with other risk analyses across the company, so across the organization. We need to ensure that the BIA findings integrate with broader risk assessments, because we will have interdependencies sometimes between different systems and services. We need to understand those dependencies. But again, a common pitfall called out by Ashoka as focusing solely on worst case outcomes, which can inflate perceived risks. So just tuck that in your memory banks for exam day. So core steps and considerations common to most business impact analysis approaches. Again, you're not going to be tested on memorizing the steps of a standard or a framework. You will be expected to be familiar with certain standards or frameworks, basically their function, but you're not going to dive into those details. So let's talk about just practical steps common to most BIA processes. So identifying the business functions. So what are the customer-facing functions, and then the back office functions that allow the business to run. We detail the activities within each function. We map any internal or external dependencies. Again, there may be dependencies where one, system A depends on system C, which depends on system B, which delivers service X, Y, or Z. So we need to understand those dependencies, which will tell us the sequence or the order of critical operations in recovering those services. That will help us to establish our recovery time objective when we look at how fast it must be recovered to avoid unacceptable loss. And that helps us to define then the resources we need for restoration. If we know how fast we need to recover, then we can figure out what technologies, what backup medium, what type of system, how many people, the resources we need to recover. And at that point, we can determine manual workarounds and the recovery point objective. Now, recovery time objective, I said, tells us how fast it must be recovered. Recovery point objective tells us how much data loss is tolerable, which would impact, for example, our backup strategy. So if I can only lose an hour of data and I need to recover in an hour, I'm probably not going to be using tape backup. I'm probably going to be backing up to disk, potentially into the cloud. We can assess at that point the maximum tolerable downtime. We can analyze upstream and downstream impacts on other functions based on those dependencies that we identified. And we can compile our findings to inform the business continuity plan. So the function, again, in the BIA, we want to have the descriptions and objectives of our recovery. We want to identify the dependencies, potential impacts, financial, operational, customer impacts to our competitive advantage, who is affected, how significantly are they affected, and really see how quickly that work backlog fills up, how much work is accumulated there in outage conditions. So this will help us inform our technology needs. What kind of server, network, software resources do we need for recovery? What kind of recovery site capabilities are going to be necessary? Manual workarounds, remote work capability. So for example, in one organization that I work with, when we perform a full interruption test, where we actually fail over to a recovery site, we also test our remote work capability. So employees actually go home for that test, and they test their ability to work remotely when we're operating from the recovery site. So we'll have some personnel that may be at the recovery site, but many people would be working from home, and we will test that capability to make sure it's functional. And along the way here, we're identifying the critical resources we need for recovery and potential alternate solutions. So if resource B is not available, what is the alternative? What is the creative way that we can recover? And these plans are also going to give us insight into, when we say the insight into the people we need, we're going to identify alternate people as well, and we'll have steps in place, plans in place, so if a certain person is not available, we can still recover. You don't want a large company dependent on one person not being on vacation. So in here, we're getting down into those technology and resource needs and the guts of what's going to be important in identifying how and how fast we can recover, what recovery options we have, how long recovery is going to take, and what we need to do to get it within the constraints, within the RTO and RPO that we've defined. So let's talk about those metrics that I said you should know. They're all right here. So we have the RTO, the recovery time objective. So how quickly must it be restored? the RPO, which is how much data loss is acceptable. And we cover these all in depth in the full course out there on YouTube, so you've got easy access to this. Acceptable interruption window, so the max tolerable business process downtime, and then the maximum tolerable downtime. So MTD is the absolute longest the business can survive disruption without fear for its ultimate survival. And then service delivery objective, so the minimum service level needed during recovery. The key takeaway here is with shorter recovery time, recovery point objectives, or a shorter acceptable interruption window, we're going to need a more expensive recovery site. So if I've got a really short RTO, RPO, AIW, I'm going to need a hot site, maybe a mirror site, maybe a cloud disaster recovery as a service solution. So I'm going to have to spend more money to facilitate that faster recovery time. I'm going to pause for a question that came up here. So SDO and AIW don't get as much emphasis in the CISSP exam. In my opinion, I don't believe they are really mentioned in most resources at all. I don't remember AIW, or certainly not service delivery objective, but I don't think acceptable interruption window was mentioned in the official study guide, which comes from Cybex for that exam. But yeah, so these are key metrics that come up from ISACA in the official materials for the CISM. So if we were to lay that out visually, here's our business continuity management strategy. The business impact analysis helps us to define those key metrics, those 5 acronyms we just looked at. Those are going to be important inputs to our business continuity plan, which is the overall plan focusing on restoring the business, and the BCP includes the disaster recovery plan, the DRP. And that's also going to help us to define how we test and maintain these plans. And the best way to make sure that a plan works is to test it periodically. Just like we say, if you've taken a backup and you want to know if that backup works, restore it and see. All right, benefits of the BIA, the last big item on that list that we started with. So what are the key benefits? Well, it helps us to understand potential losses better. We quantify financial and operational impact. It helps us to prioritize our recovery, focuses efforts on the most critical functions, and it helps us to identify dependency. So the BIA will reveal crucial links between processes and resources across services, across the business. And ultimately, if we leverage these, if we use these findings effectively, it will help us to improve our incident response awareness. It's going to educate the organization on impacts and recovery needs. So bottom line, the BIA tells you what's critical, how bad is it if it breaks, how long do you have to fix it, and what you need to get it fixed. But the BIA drives an intelligent business continuity and disaster recovery strategy, bottom line. All right, and that brings us to number 7 on our list, policies, standards, and guidelines. And I promised you that I would talk about frameworks here for a moment as well, so I'll remember to do that. So you should be familiar with policies, standards, and guidelines and procedures by relationship. So if we look at these in terms of their context, policy is a general management statement. A standard is a specific technical set of controls. A procedure is a step-by-step set of instructions. That tells us how to implement a standard or a policy. And then we have guidelines, which are recommendations and best practices. So in terms of the questions they answer, policy tells us why we aim to achieve something. The standard tells us what we implement, and the procedure tells us how to implement it. So we'd say these are all mandatory. Guidelines, recommendations, and best practices, those are nice to have, but they are, generally speaking, optional. So to go a bit deeper, the security policy sets the overall vision and goals for information security. Standards translate the policy into specific technical requirements and best practices. The security procedures provide detailed instructions, think step-by-step instructions, on how to implement the standards. And security guidelines offer additional recommendations and best practices that can be adopted to further enhance security. So security policies are providing that overall high-level direction and objectives for information security from within an organization. Those are coming kind of top-down. They define the why behind our security measures. So they're general statements and principles, often very broad in their scope. For example, the organization is committed to protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of its information assets. So that tells us kind of at a high level what the goal is. It doesn't tell us what we're going to implement or how we're going to implement it to achieve that aim. Standards, on the other hand, define mandatory technical specifications and best practices for implementing a security policy. It provides the what and when for achieving security goals. It's more detailed than policies. It's going to specify technical requirements for systems, configurations, and processes. So, for example, in government organizations, there will be standards that government agencies have to follow. So, for example, NIST has what's called the Risk Management Framework, which is actually a framework that it's a standard. It's a framework that's mandatory for the agencies to which it applies. On the other hand, they have the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which is designed for non-government entities, and it's purely optional. Two different things. But for example, a standard credit card data must be encrypted at rest, in transit, and in use using a compliant encryption algorithm. I'm sure we'd see something like that within PCI DSS, which applies to credit card handlers. And it's a contractual compliance obligation, PCI DSS. So security procedures, those are the step-by-step instructions, the details on how to perform specific tasks related to our controls. It defines the how for implementation. It's going to be highly detailed, outlining the exact actions taken in specific situations. Simple example, a procedure for incident response. So upon discovering a security incident, we'd follow these steps. Isolate the affected system, notify the security team, document the incident. So don't gauge the efficacy of those particular steps. The point is that's what a procedure would look like. It would have step-by-step guidance. In terms of guidelines, it offers recommendations and best practices for achieving security objectives. They're not mandatory. They provide you could do this for a more effective result. They're the least specific. They offer recommendations that can be adapted to specific situations. For example, employees are encouraged to take advantage of security awareness training program. Well, we know that would lead to a more security aware employee and overall, when broadly applied, a more security aware culture within the organization. So speaking to frameworks, when you see frameworks, you'll see mention of different frameworks, but I think those most likely to come up on the exam to be mentioned would be those under the control of ISACA. So you would have COBIT, COBIT, that you should be familiar with. At a high level, you should understand its function. You don't need to memorize all the steps, but because it's an ISACA product and an ISACA solution, the COBIT as a framework is something you should be familiar with. BMIS is another one mentioned in the exam, and then the Capability Maturity Model Integration, CMMI. That was actually acquired by ISACA some years ago. So COBIT, BMIS, and CMMI are three that I think would be likely to come up on the exam to be mentioned because they're under ISACA's control. All covered in the full course. All right, so let me give you an analogy to kind of tie all these together. So think of a policy as like the blueprint that defines the overall vision and requirements. So if I think of building a house, the blueprint describes the vision and overall requirements for the house. The standard would be the building codes and the mandatory specifications I need to meet as I am building that house. How the electrical wiring needs to be completed, the plumbing, any safety criteria. The procedure would be the step-by-step instructions for the construction teams that pour the foundation, frame the walls, run the wire. And this is another area that's very unique to the CISM exam. You're not going to see coverage of metrics on almost any other exam that I can think of. So reporting metrics provide the target the organization is aiming for and indicators of progress and performance on the path to that target or that goal. So there is the critical success factor, or CSF, which are the events or elements that must occur to achieve the KGIs, which are the key goal indicators, the high-level strategy goals. So the critical success factors define the events or elements that must occur to hit the key goal. And the key performance indicator, or KPI, track performance of processes or progress en route. So we see ISACA mention that effective metrics are both relevant and quantitatively measurable. So if we have metrics that are measuring numbers, and I would say there's a third element here, so they need to be relevant and quantitatively measurable in order to be actionable. So if we're tracking metrics that don't spur action of some sort when we are measuring a result, that metric is not very helpful. That metric needs to tell us if we are meeting our goals or not, and gives us some indication that causes us to change course when we've gotten off course. So metrics need to be relevant and quantitatively measurable, and then that third implied option is they need to be actionable. They need to spur action. But they're indicators of progress toward that target. So if I were to lay it out visually here, we have that critical success factor, the event or elements that must occur. We have a key goal indicator and a key risk indicator. I want to talk about how these help us, and then the key performance indicator. So let's lay these out in terms of time, so which direction they are facing. So generally speaking, a key goal indicator is backward facing. It reports the result after the fact. We have achieved a goal. A key risk indicator is forward facing. It predicts potential roadblocks. When we see a spike in certain metrics, for example, that may indicate a change in operations or in the security landscape that predicts there could be a problem if we don't address it proactively. So KPIs are generally backward facing. They report on past performance. We would call that a lagging metric or indicator. But some KPIs can also forecast trends or future indicators. So they can also be what we'd call a leading indicator. So when a metric is forward facing, we'd call that leading. When it looks into the past and reports on what's already happened, that's a lagging indicator. So just a few limitations and concerns here. So metrics show part of the picture, like configuration compliance or performance thresholds. But they don't often answer the more nuanced or big picture questions on their own, like how secure are we really? Is our investment enough? Have we invested in security to the degree we need to meet our goals? Answering those requires broader context from risk assessments and security audits. But metrics confirm the cumulative results delivered by individual components. That's the point. But all covered in the full course, very unique to this exam. You need to understand these, and I hope that visualization helps you. All right, that brings us to number 9 on the list, cloud computing. And this falls into that bucket of foundational technologies you're expected to be familiar with on exam day that would be referenced indirectly at the very least. So let's start with the shared responsibility model. I want to cover shared responsibility, cloud deployment models, and cloud service models. So shared responsibility model begins with on-premises, so your private cloud, that's 100% yours. The responsibility is easy there. Now, as we move from left to right, we move into IaaS, which are your virtual machines, and you see here the cloud service provider takes over responsibility of the underlying infrastructure and the facilities and the power, etc. You're managing the VM, the operating system, the patching, the applications, the data, etc. Going on further, we look at platform as a service, where we have things like database as a service or applications as a service, and there we're just focused on developing our applications and managing our data. We don't worry about the runtime, the middleware, the operating system, none of the infrastructure. The CSP's taking on more responsibility. And then we move into software as a service. We're really largely just a user there. So if you think about Microsoft 365, formerly Office 365, you set up your users, you apply the licenses. You might buy a third-party product to handle, backing up data in OneDrive so you can restore more quickly. But you're sharing a little bit of responsibility, but as a customer, you're basically just a user as an organization. So as you move from left to right in shared responsibility, the CSP takes on more responsibility. But there you have your private cloud, and when you connect your private cloud, your data center, to the public cloud, to a Microsoft Azure, Amazon AWS, Google Cloud Platform, you're creating the hybrid cloud, probably the most common deployment model today. So if you're familiar, you're not. I'll just take you through so you've got some familiarity here. So in IaaS, the CSP provides the building blocks: the network, the storage, the compute, the data center. They have the staff, the hardware, all of it, right? The customer is managing, just what they're using. The usage is metered. You're typically paying for VMs by the minute. It eases scale up, scale out, scale down. I can deploy multiple VMs. I can make them bigger or larger. They're template. I can up or reduce the size easily with the push of a button. And I'm out of the data center business, so I'm not worried about energy and cooling costs. So examples here, if you're not experienced with cloud yet: Azure Virtual Machines, Amazon EC2, Google Cloud Platform's Compute Engine. Those are all IaaS examples. If we move into platform as a service, where as a customer, we're focused just on deployment and management of apps, and the CSP is taking on managing all of the infrastructure and our middleware, our runtime environment. So here, we're really just focused on our collaboration, on our development, doing things that benefit our business. We can run multiple languages, typically multiple programming languages, that is. So when it says multiple languages, we're talking about Python, Rust, C#, etc. We can run multiple languages. So examples here would be database as a service, like Microsoft's Azure SQL database, API management, where we can manage our APIs in terms of their security and customer access. And then app service, which would be like web application development and hosting. And then software as a service, where as a customer we just configure a few features, where we have some shared responsibility for access to the applications and the data, but the CSP is doing all the heavy work. We're just really managing access, making sure we don't give our users the ability to delete all our data, for example. And in Office 365, it's pretty common. We'll subscribe to a third-party service that'll back up all our OneDrive so we can restore it faster than would be possible natively if we had a ransomware compromise, for example. So you're basically very limited skill and responsibility for the customer in SaaS. And the service is always up to date. It's accessible globally. We're really just a user. Good examples here would include Office 365, now called Microsoft 365, ServiceNow, the most I think popular ITSM platform, so for like help desk and change management and the like, and then Salesforce, a very popular CRM. All right, so the cloud deployment model, so how we deploy, we've got private cloud where it's 100% ours. We have the public cloud, which is our major CSPs, Azure, Amazon, Google Cloud Platform. A community cloud is kind of like a private cloud, but shared by a number of organizations with a common interest. So for example, you might have a community cloud for insurance companies in the Houston, Texas area, because it's a little more cost effective. It allows those organizations with common interests to share some costs. And then hybrid cloud, where the customer connects their data center to the public cloud, often with a VPN or MPLS connectivity. That's going to give us flexibility in compliance and scalability scenarios, so we can scale up with our latest and greatest customer-facing services as we need. But if we've got legacy services that run on old software versions we're not ready to take to the cloud, we can keep running those in our data center. And then one more thing you should be familiar with for the exam in the CISM context would be rights and capabilities to perform basic investigations or audit. What we'd call the right to audit clause. These are written into supply chain contracts. So with regular vendors, we might write a right to audit clause into our contracts, which would allow us to specify that an auditor can go visit the premises to inspect and ensure that the contractor is complying with contractual obligations. This would help an auditor identify faulty or inferior quality, short shipments, goods not delivered, basically a lack of compliance by our vendor, in whatever form that might be. But I say this to get to the more important thing, which is you do not have right to audit these big CSPs. You can't tell a CSP you're going to audit them. But what they do to give you that assurance is they offer SOC 2 Type 2 reports and other reports for ISO compliance and the like on demand. So for Azure, AWS, or GCP, you can go to their portal and get a SOC 2 Type 2 report, which actually gives you an assurance that that service is functional and secure in its operation, because the SOC 2 Type 2 actually looks at that service over an operational period of like 6 months or longer. But you can get it on demand. It usually requires signing an NDA in portal. You'll do a little e-sign quickly. But that's how you handle an audit for a CSP. You just go get the report on demand. All right. Last but not least, that brings us to answering questions, especially difficult questions, and managing your time. I am going to take you through a system. I've kind of productized a very standardized, easy to remember strategy for answering questions effectively, for improving your odds of answering correctly and managing your time effectively on the live exam. If you've taken my CISSP materials, you've seen this strategy before. I'm going to give it to you in the CISM context, and we will answer several questions. I'll walk you through some questions. You'll right up to the end of our 2 hours together here, so you see this in action. So the strategy here is what I call the READ strategy. This is an acronym, and if you use this system, I've kind of productized it so you can memorize this, you can remember it easily, and just apply it as you are taking practice quizzes. So READ stands for review, eliminate, analyze, and decide. So it's intended to be easy to remember when you're choosing the correct answer. I've had many exam candidates across the CISSP exam and now a couple for the CISM. My content for CISM is newer on the scene. I've only had it out for about a quarter now. But I've had many candidates tell me this system worked very well for them in navigating those difficult questions. So it starts with review. The goal here is to just identify what is the core issue you're solving for. What are they asking? We're going to read through the details of what's being asked, the requirements and the context. Is a specific framework being referenced, for example? Which leg of the CIA triad does the question speak to? If we can see that we're solving for a confidentiality problem, we can rule out answers that speak to integrity or availability, for example. It allows us to go to that next step to eliminate definitely wrong answers. We want to identify which answers are definitely not correct. We're going to identify and remove unimportant details, obvious distractors, answers we know are just not right based on our knowledge, based on what is being asked. And this step is often going to eliminate one or two answers immediately. So what happens if we have a multiple choice question? Remember, your questions on the CISM are multiple choice. So what does that do to our odds of answering correctly if we remove two definitely wrong answers out of 4 options immediately? Even if we don't for sure know the correct answer, we're now down to 2 options instead of 4. It doubles our chances of even guessing correctly. And that's what the system is about, is getting to that correct answer more reliably, increasing the odds that you'll get the right answer. So then we analyze our options here. We've eliminated the wrong answers. Now we want to go back. Let's prioritize the solution requirements we see based on context, identify all the requirements that are being asked of us, because some questions may actually have multiple requirements. So you need to establish your priorities. And as a security leader, your priorities are clear. Human safety, number 1. 2, operate the business securely, number 2. 3, manage risk cost effectively. 3, so I want to sort my requirements in priority order. If there's an answer out there that solves the technical problem at the cost of human life, that's not the right answer, is it? Because human safety is my number 1 obligation as a security leader. So I get those requirements sorted out. I set my priorities. Now I'm going to analyze the answers I have left. So tips for this step is really remember your priorities, okay? Human safety, keep the business running securely. manage risk while exercising due diligence and due care. But remember, as a security leader, call an outside expert is always an option. If you need to conduct an external audit, the right answer is going to be to contract an external firm, for example. But based on the answers that we have there, we need to now decide. So for the remaining answers, I'm going to evaluate each answer on its own. I'm going to identify what I do and don't like about each on its own. As a leader, I'm focused on the big picture, so I'm going to see if I can find an option in there where maybe one answer actually encompasses the others. And if it does, I'm going to pick that big picture answer that's all-encompassing. On the CISM exam especially, be very wary of answers that call for a technical hands-on response, because this is a managerial exam. It is not a technical exam. You're a security leader here. You are not the doer. You're not the engineer in the chair. You're not the SOC analyst doing the investigation. So I'm going to take a good people or process focused answer over a technical answer every time. Every time. And remember that regulatory requirements override company policies. You can have a company policy that says you have to do A, B, or C, but if that conflicts with a regulatory requirement, the regulation, a law would always win over that. So just for quick reference here, what I'll do is in the takeaway, in the follow-up email, I'll send you out this one-page reference. You can kind of keep this up on another screen while you're taking your practice quizzes. So when you hit the review, when you're looking at a question, drill down and really, really focus on what's being asked. Look at the adjectives. Look at what the true end goal is we're solving for. Do you see any frameworks or regulatory requirements in there? Then start eliminating. Weed out the unimportant details. The answers you know are just not right based on where you are in the process or in the circumstances you're solving for. Analyze. What are the solution requirements? And if there are multiple requirements, again, prioritize them based on those CISO priorities. Human safety, keep the business running, manage risk cost effectively. And then decide, evaluate each answer. What do we like about each? What do we dislike? Is there one answer that encompasses the others, that is a leader-focused, big-picture answer? But remember your priorities. That's going to be very important. And if you just keep this up on another page and just train your brain to walk through these 4 steps as you're answering questions, I promise you, whether you remember read or not, it's very easy to remember, but I don't care about you memorizing the acronym. It's memorizing the process. It's establishing a repeatable process so you get down to fewer answers to choose from every time. So I hope you find this helpful. Let's walk through a few questions together. And what I'm going to do is we'll go through this process and we'll weed out some wrong answers, and I'll have you tell me what you think the right answer is each time. So let's jump into our first question here. So which of the following would best help ensure the alignment between information security and business functions? So I want you to just remember something as we go through these here right away. You will frequently encounter questions on this exam where you have multiple answers that are some degree of correct. So you see this question right away says, which of the following would best help to ensure the alignment between information security and business functions? So there's not one right answer, but there is always a best answer. And you need to be able to justify why it's best when you're trying to pick. So is it A, providing funding for information security efforts? So we're looking to ensure alignment between information security and business functions. Is that going to help us provide funding for InfoSec efforts? Is it B, establishing a security awareness program? Does that ensure alignment between information security and the business? Well, it can educate our users in that way. Is it C, establishing an information security governance committee where we have those different personas on the committee? We're going to have the leaders, we're going to have our business process owners, we're going to have IT and security functions all on that committee. Or is it developing the information security policies, those high-level statements that give us our why? So which of these most effectively ensures alignment between between the information security function and the business function? Well, there are a couple I can rule out here right away. So providing funding for information security efforts has very little to do with information security and business alignment. I have to have my alignment sorted out so I know what my priorities are first before I can go ask for funding and get funding. So that's definitely not the best option here. Also, establishing a security awareness program, I have to establish alignment between information security and business functions and set my goals before I know what my agenda is going to be in a security awareness training program. So I know these two definitely cannot be the answer. So that leaves me establishing an information security governance committee, a committee that's going to have my leadership represented, my business process, my business units and the process owners represented, and my IT and security functions quite typically. And then developing my information security policies, which come top down typically, or at least input from top down, that define, policies define my why to some degree. So which do you think is the best answer for ensuring alignment between information security and the business? Is it C or D? Drop it in the comments or in the chat. Okay, I see some C's and D's. The right answer here is C, establishing an information security governance committee. So by involving key stakeholders from the different business functions, leadership and IT and security, this facilitates top-down collaboration, communication, and decision-making that promote the integration of information security into the organization's core business processes. At the end of the day, remember, security is here to serve the business. That's our focus. Well done. A lot of right answers from you on that one. So, but it's like, again, it's likely formed, the alignment is formed under the direction of all these stakeholders, but this committee will typically be formed under the direction of the board of directors of the CEO. So putting this committee together in the first place, the CEO is probably going to be making some calls as to who's on there. All right, next question. What does an information security strategy document that includes specific links to an organization's business activities primarily indicate? So an information security strategy document, a document that includes specific links to an organization's business activities primarily indicate. Does it indicate strategic alignment? Does it indicate value delivery? So we say that our information security program has to deliver value. Is it an indicator of performance measurement? Or is it an indicator of assurance process integration? So we have an information security strategy document that includes specific links to an organization's business activities. So it's connecting its specific links to business activity. So we could say it another way, it is linking information security strategy to the business activities. So there are a couple we can knock out here right away. This is not discussing in any way delivery of value, although linking strategy to business activities does, ultimately result in delivering values, but it's not a direct indicator. And this has nothing to do with measuring performance. That happens with metrics, right? So we know these are definitely wrong. So we talked about assurance processes earlier, right? I'm not going to tell you what those are. I want to see if you remember. So is the best answer here assurance process integration, or is it strategic alignment, which we said is pervasive throughout the exam, right? I think you're all going to get this one. Drop your answer in the chat, A or D. And yeah, virtually everybody got that. Well done. It's strategic alignment. So in guiding a security program, a meaningful performance measurement and assurance process integration will first rely on an understanding of business objectives, which will be an outcome of strategic alignment. So when we're connecting information security to the business, that is the strategic alignment. All right, let's go on to the next question here. So which information assets should be included in security risk assessment? Is it A, assets inside the organization? Well, they definitely should. That's a plausible answer. Those that are already classified and labeled, presumably we've identified the key assets, hopefully in a business impact analysis, but do we restrict it to those we've classified and labeled already? Is it those that support business processes? We've definitely drilled down on that in the business impact analysis, right? We've identified the core services, the components, the dependencies. Or is it D, those that have tangible value? So there are a couple of answers I can rule out here right away. So if I'm ignoring assets outside the organization, assets in my supply chain that I may depend on, like maybe a recovery site, I'm making a big mistake, right? So I know that's definitely not right. I'm going to rule out those that are already classified and labeled, because what if I have failed to consider some assets and I find those, I limit my auditor to just looking at those that are already classified and labeled. I'm restricting their scope and we potentially continue to miss something. I'm going to let that trained auditor, go in. If it's my own internal auditor, which is typically the case in a security risk assessment, I'm going to go tell them to assess the situation. I'm not going to put undue restrictions on them, causing them to potentially miss something important. So those two are definitely wrong. So that leaves us, which assets should be included in security risk assessment? Is it those that support business processes, or those that have tangible values? Drop your answer in the chat. Is it C or D? The answer is C, those that support business processes. The focus of a risk assessment should be on the information assets or potentially the infrastructure that directly support or interact with critical business processes. That enables the organization to prioritize our risk management effort on assets that are important to our operations. And it doesn't restrict the scope of our assessment unnecessarily in any way. Well done. All right, let's move on to the next one here. So, the most important objective of monitoring key risk indicators related to information security is which of the following? So again, the most important objective of monitoring key risk indicators related to information security is which of the following? Is it A, reduce risk management costs? Is that the most important objective of a KRI? Is it to meet regulatory compliance requirements? Is it C, to identify a change in security exposures? So as we talked about with our roadmap, conditions can change over time, right? The security landscape, the business landscape. Or is it D, minimize the loss from security incidents? So these are all useful, meaningful objectives, but which is the most important objective of monitoring the key risk indicator? Now, remind me, I want to see if you remember this, is a key risk indicator forward-looking or backward-looking? Yes, it's forward-looking. Well done. You all got that. Well done. All right, so let's rule out a couple of wrong answers here. I want you to tell me which you think are wrong. So go ahead and drop two definitely wrong answers in the chat. I want to see how you do with this. Okay, I see a lot of C's and D's. See an A and a D. Okay, so A, definitely reduce risk management costs. That's not the most important objective here. It's definitely a good secondary goal. We want to reduce costs, but my number one objective is human safety. My number two objective is keeping the business running securely. Number three is managing risk cost effectively. So reducing cost is not a primary goal. Meeting regulatory requirements, also an important secondary goal. It's not the most important in this list. It's not the most fundamental for a key risk indicator. Because regulatory compliance speaks to compliance, not risk, right? All right, that leaves us identifying changes in security exposures or minimizing the loss from security incidents. Both important goals. Which do you think it is, C or D? Drop it in the comments. It is, in fact, identifying changes in security exposures. Remember, we said with a risk indicator, when we see a shift in that metric, a spike in that metric one direction or another, it's an indicator of a change in our security exposure that would trigger us to take proactive action. But by monitoring KRIs, the organization can proactively detect and respond to changes in security exposure. So because we knew that a KRI was forward-looking, that gave us a clue as to some right and wrong answers, didn't it? So a good reason to know those metrics, not only know what their function is, but the direction they primarily face. But that allows for timely mitigation actions. It ensures that emerging risks are addressed before they escalate into a full-blown incident, before we're compromised. All right, next question. The Information Security Manager has developed a document to describe the information security program's mission, vision, roles and responsibilities, and processes. This document is known as a guideline. Is it B, a policy? So is it that high-level policy top-down giving us the why? Is it a standard? Do you remember what a standard is? Or is it a charter? So I think you all are going to get this right, and I think you're going to get it right easily. So I would say definitely guidelines. Optional guidance, that's out. And a standard, which are the technical what, that has nothing to do with mission, vision, roles, and responsibility. So a policy's coming top down, a charter's coming top down. Which of these is going to contain the program's mission, vision, roles, and responsibilities and processes? Drop it in the chat. 100%. Y'all are crushing it here. Good job. It is, in fact, D, the charter. The charter describes the various facets of the function or the program that really best fits the description here. Well done. All right. Next question. Security technology should be selected primarily on the basis of their A, benefits in comparison to their costs. So should we select security technologies primarily based on the benefits in comparison to their costs, their relative evaluations and trade publications, based on their use of new and emerging technologies, so modern technologies to address modern threats, that's a relevant goal, or their ability to mitigate business risks. So security technology should be selected primarily, so primarily means should be selected first, so most importantly on the basis of what? So there's two here we can obviously cross out. So if we're looking at primarily, their evaluations in a trade publication, so the opinion of others, that's not the most important thing. That's not our most important goal within the organization. Their use of new and emerging technology, so the shiny new technology is not always the best solution. So sometimes a tried and true solution is a better option. Maybe the most modern, CCTV is not as effective at preventing physical breaches as just having a good security patrol with guard dogs, right? One of those is more modern than others, but the other is going to be more effective. So those two are definitely not the answer. So to whittle down then to our final two here, security technology should be selected primarily on the basis of their benefits in comparison to their cost or their ability to mitigate business risks. A or D? Drop your answer in the chat. Give you a minute. Well done. A lot of right answers here. The answer is D, their ability to mitigate business risk. At the end of the day, the most fundamental evaluation criterion for the appropriate selection of any security technology is its ability to reduce or eliminate business risk. The ultimate investment should be based on their overall value in relation to their cost, and that value can be demonstrated in terms of risk mitigation. So before we have applied any security controls, we have risk that exists. It's called the inherent risk. It's the risk that exists in absence of controls. This is covered in full in Domain 2 in the full course. You will get into this. After we have applied a security control, there is still some risk that remains. That is called the residual risk. So if I have $10,000 of risk before I apply a security control, and I have $5,000 of risk after I apply the security control, that tells me the value of that control is approximately $5,000. So I want to have a control that if a control reduces risk by $5,000, I want to make sure that control costs less than I benefit from it. But goal number one is its ability to mitigate the business risk. Then I can compare my options in terms of cost effectiveness and make my decision. All right, let's do one more. So which of the following provides best confirmation that the business continuity and disaster recovery objectives were achieved during testing? Is it A, better adherence to policies? So does better adherence to policies, is that the best confirmation that our objectives were met during our DR testing? Is it that information assets have been assigned to owners per our BCDR plans? Well, that's definitely going to happen at some point in the process, probably back well back in the planning phases if we're doing it right. The recovery, is it that the recovery point objective was deficient in our DR test? Is that the best confirmation that our objectives were achieved, that we had a deficiency? It's important to watch those adjectives and adverbs and verbs. And then we see the last one, recovery time objective was met during testing. There's two here we can cross out right away. I want you to give me two definitely wrong answers. So we need confirmation that our BCDR objectives were achieved during testing. That's the key, right? Remember, with that read strategy, we're identifying what they're asking. So they're asking us confirmation that our objectives were met during testing. Now let's eliminate. Better adherence to policies, that doesn't happen during testing. Remember, the policy is that high-level statement that gives us our why. Information assets have been assigned to owners per BCDR plans. That's going to give us an idea of who is responsible and guiding some efforts potentially, but not something we worry about during testing. During testing, I'm worried about RPO and RTO. So option C says the RPO was deficient, and option D says the RTO was met. So definitely one obvious answer there. And it is that the RTO was met during testing. So consistently achieving the recovery time objective during testing provides objective, provable evidence that business continuity and disaster recovery plan objectives have been met. It is objective, provable by fact evidence, and that is the reality. The best way to know that your recovery plans work is to test them. Now, I want to give you two bits of advice before we part here. So number one, you've got the read strategy here. I want you to leverage this and get yourself into a good system that's repeatable. But on the exam, just answer the question with facts you are given. Do not make assumptions. Do not invent additional scenario context. Don't assume something else is true or invent that additional context, because it will lead you to the wrong answer. Another way we say this is just answer the question. And I'll give you that cheat sheet, so I'll make sure the cheat sheet's it's available for you in a PDF or like a JPEG format so you can keep it up on your third screen. But it's time to just get your materials and just get started. Begin. No better time than the present. You will have access to me through the Discord link. I'll send you the invite in the follow-up message with the replay link for this session. You can reach me on LinkedIn always. And then I also have that form where you can ask me questions and also upload attachments if you need to give me an attachment to help supplement or give me context to your question. Bear in mind, we're on the Buddy SLA. I'll always do what I can to answer you. If you don't hear from me within, say, a couple of days, particularly on a weekend, I might be a little slow in answering. If you don't hear from me, ping me after a couple of days and say, hey, I put this question out there. Maybe you missed it. I'm not at all offended by that. I want to be helpful where I can. And you can always @ me, over on Discord. But that's what I have for you, my friends. I wish you best of luck on the exam. If you have questions after we part, by all means, reach out. And I look forward to hearing your big win on exam day. So when you get that result back, come back and ping me and tell me how you did. And until next time, take care.